Hello and welcome back. And if you're new, welcome. Today on the bench we have a Yaesu FT89E7 that's come in for repair and modification. The customer has asked me to do the crystal filter modification on this, and since it's going to be on the bench anyway, has asked me to replace this encoder for the clarifier. Now there's about a dozen videos out there, I think, on the crystal mod, so we're not going to get into that today, but we are going to show you how to replace this encoder, how to get to it and how to replace it, so that if you've accidentally broken one of these off, you won't have any fear about trying to give it a go on yourself. And as you can see, the knob comes right off and the shaft is broken. Now the owner had cleverly added a piece of copper wire here and some adhesive, but over the time the adhesive has failed, and since it was going to be in the shop anyway, asked me to drop this encoder in. So we're going to show you how to open this thing up, how to get to the encoder, and how to change it out. So let's get started. Okay, the first thing I did to gain access to the top cover was remove part of the mobile bracket. And if you don't have a mobile bracket on there, there's a skip or a step you can skip. Now we're going to take out the screws holding the top cover on. And here's a caution, and I say this repeatedly, and I see so many people ignoring this. They see a small screw, the first thing they do is grab a number 2 Phillips or a number 0, and they stick it in there and they start twisting on these screws, and they damage the screws, they raise burrs on them, they damage the finish. This is the wrong screwdriver for those screws. Just because they're close in size to the screw doesn't make it the right screwdriver. As you can see, there's a fair amount of play back and forth. The screw's coming loose. There's a fair amount of play back and forth in that screw. Good chance you're going to damage the screw. This is a job for a number 1 Phillips. Even though the head of this screwdriver is actually larger than the diameter of the head of the screw, this is the proper fit. And if I push that down in there, it stays. It actually fits the screw. And if I do it again, it should stay right in there. It actually seats down. There is no, whoops, I turned that one loose already. There is virtually no side-to-side play in there at all. It fits flat, it fits snugly, and it won't damage the screw. Alright, I'll get off my soapbox. To remove the top cover, or the one with the speaker in it, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 screws. Don't touch the 2 that are on the speaker. You do not need to remove those 2. So I'm going to remove these screws around the outer edge, and we'll pick it up from there. The screws are all removed from the edges. And before we lift this cover, bear in mind there's a speaker mounted here and there's a switch mounted here, which means we can't just whip this cover off. There are going to be wires and connectors, so we want to be careful. Anytime you see a speaker, a switch, anything like that on the cover, you know there's going to be wires connected. And let's see if I can get my fingernail underneath here. I may have to get a spudger. Whoops, almost had it. Come on, there we go. So I've got it loose, and immediately it's resisting me. I've got wires over here for the speaker, little small connector. You want to get down in there with something. If I can get my fingernails down in there to work it loose. Very carefully work these loose. Don't just pull on them, otherwise you'll rip the wires out of the connector. And as I lift, sure enough, we have wires connected to the power switch. There's a little tab on the connector down here. I'll depress that, work the switch back or the connector back and forth carefully. Now the cover's free. There's the top cover removed. Now I'll flip it over and we'll do the bottom. We'll take off the bottom. Upside down on the bench, we have to remove the bottom cover. Now the bottom cover also happens to be the switching power supply on this particular radio. First thing I'm going to do is pull the DC power connector, so there's nothing left there. There are 3 screws along the back, 1, 2, and 3. Do not remove these 3 screws here. They do not have to come off, and in fact you're going to get in trouble if you do. The same thing pertains to the front. We have 1, 2, 3 screws here. We do not want to touch those. We want the 1, 2, 3 that are down here very close to the front panel. So we have 6 screws. 1, 2, 3, 3 in the back, 6. So I'll get those out and we'll pick it up. All 6 screws are removed. Now we're going to remove the bottom cover / power supply unit. Remember, we have this unplugged. There is some grounding braid in here. It's a foam rubber with a braided steel or copper mesh, probably tin copper mesh over the top of it to provide an RF ground between here and the main chassis. These occasionally stick. Be assured, if you have these 3 screws and the very front 3 screws removed, the bottom cover will come off. I'm going to use the bail here for a little bit of leverage and put my thumb underneath the grommet on the back, and we'll pull this gently. There, it popped free. I could feel it stick a little bit. There's our power supply assembly. We can set that aside. We're done with it. Put that back here, and actually I'm going to set it on the shelf behind me so it's not in the way. Then we'll move on. With the covers removed, it's now time to remove the front panel so we have access to the circuit board to replace the pot. Inside of the radio here, let's make sure I'm in frame, there's a screw here with a little tab and a screw here with a tab. Those have to come out. The same thing on the opposite side. I don't want to set this on the knobs and end up with another controller broken. We have a tab here and a tab here with a screw. These tabs look metallic. Be advised, they are not. They are plastic. You want to be very careful with these. If you break these off, there'll be nothing holding the front panel on anymore. The same caution applies when it comes time to replace the front panel and you return the screws. Don't over torque those. I will put the panel back in and wiggle it gently as I tighten the screw, and when I no longer can move the panel in and out, I'm going to stop. We don't want to over torque these screws and damage those plastic tabs. So I'll set this thing down very quickly, and I think I'll even do this on camera. I'll take these 4 screws out, put them in my little pan back there. You do have a little pan so you don't lose your screws, right? Very important not to have a screw loose. Although I've been accused of that on many occasions. We'll go in here and grab that guy. Now be careful when lifting this. You don't want to lift it because half of it's been disconnected. Now you'll break the other tabs off, so we have to be very careful. Turn this over. Take the screws out of this side. Notice I'm supporting the panel so it doesn't flop over. And that screws out. Now this panel will simply pull right out to the front. And see, these are just plastic. So you want to be very careful. Now, you can disconnect the wiring harness. I am not going to. I'm going to be very careful and simply work with it in place. But bear in mind, be careful of these. So I'm going to remove the screws with the little copper circle around them. And I should be able to pull this panel completely off. Now that rotary encoder, let me get this back in the frame here, or get the camera moved. That'd be better. The rotary encoder is right behind here. And here we have 3 control tabs and 2 mounting tabs. The 2 mounting tabs are here, and the 3 control tabs are here. So I'm going to get my desoldering tool up and warmed up and ready to pull out the encoder. Actually, I'll probably do that before I remove the board so I have something to hang on to it. Bearing in mind, these are plastic. You don't want to get your desoldering tool up against them and damage them. Then we'll remove the screws, pull the board out, put the new encoder in, solder everything back together. So let me get my desoldering tool warmed up. Okay, I've removed the knob from the up-down encoder. You do not have to remove the volume control or the main tuning knob. And I have removed the larger of the diameter screws that are in here. Do not touch these smaller diameter ones in the center. There's one there, there's one here. These do not have to be removed. It's only this slightly larger size. And I believe I misspoke earlier. and call this a number 1. This is a number 2 Phillips. This is what I used on the cover screws. These, however, indeed do use a number 1 Phillips. This is a number 1 Phillips. It fits very tightly in the screws. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of these screws. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as you can see. Then there is an odd flathead screw. I think they call this a cheese head screw that is hidden up underneath here. Excuse me. Right up in this corner. That has to be removed as well. Bearing in mind, this stuff all threads into plastic. Be very, very gentle with it. There's no need to remove all of the connectors or disturb any of those fittings. There's sufficient room here, once those screws are removed, to gently pull the board back, and there's our offending encoder right there. And all of the solder has been removed using my desoldering tool, and we're gently going to work this thing out of here. I said we're gently going to work this thing out of here. Come on, I know you can do it. There it is. There's the old rotary encoder with the broken shaft. I'll very carefully work the new rotary encoder into here so we don't have to disconnect any of these connections and take a chance on damaging the connector. And when I've got this back in the position, worked in here, I'll solder it back in. We'll pick up. Our encoder is in place. I merely slid the shaft out the front. I did this off camera because it's so awkward working around the camera. It just slows the process down. Slid the shaft through the hole in the front. Very carefully lined up all the pins, slipped it into position. The two little tabs here kind of hold it in position once it's in there. Now I'm going to replace all of the screws that I took out. And I say this every video, when you're putting screws back in, these are thread cutting or self-tapping type screws, you don't just put them in there and twist away. Turn them backwards and listen. Hear the click? I'll do it again. Click. That means you've found the original thread. These should go in with no effort at all. If you're having to put torque on these, you're cutting new threads, and after 1 or 2 times you're going to destroy the boss, the plastic boss. Again, I'm going to just put it in place and turn it backwards. Click. Oh, it bound, so I'm going to back up to the next click. Nope. There it is. Absolutely no effort to go in. Absolutely torque free. That way you don't end up cutting new threads every time you put it in, and this can be taken apart several times without damage. Otherwise, you're going to end up damaging the plastic, and the screws will no longer hold. So I'm going to put the rest of these in off camera, and we'll pick up from there after I've got the the encoder soldered. Now I'm going to solder the encoder against the board, and if I can get this up close to the camera and in focus, you should see a little post right here in the corner, another post right here. There's one here and one here. Those are designed to press against the board and level the pot so that it's sticking straight up, so that it's absolutely perpendicular to the board. That will ensure that when everything's put together, let me swing the camera around here, that will ensure if it's sitting on the 4 little posts and I'm pressing it against it, it'll ensure that the shaft is perpendicular and it's centered on the hole in the front panel. Now, there's a little trick that I've shown on a lot of videos. Let me swing the camera around here again. Oops, sorry about that, the fast pan. We're trying to do this slowly. I'm going to solder one terminal, and only one to start with. Now I'm going to put my finger against the back of the pot, apply gentle pressure. There. I felt it move. It went in against the board. Now it's standing proud on the board on the 4 posts, and it's in the correct position. Now I can solder the other tab that's over here, and I'm going to do the same thing over here. It didn't move, so I'm pretty flat on the board. Now that those two are partially soldered and in place, I'll turn it over and inspect it. Sure enough, it's dead center in the hole. It's nice and perpendicular to the board. So I'll go ahead, I'll solder up the 3 electrical connections, and I'll finish up these 2 pads. I'll finish up the solder because I've only soldered on the outside of those 2 right at the moment, just to make sure everything was in position. Then we'll put this back together. The control is soldered in. I've taken a cotton swab and some alcohol and cleaned most of the flux off. Now, I wasn't real fussy with it. Most 90% of it's gone, but the factory had also hand soldered this one. It was obvious, and all that flux was down here. I cleaned most of that off as well. Then I use a 5X loop to go down and carefully inspect the work I've done to make sure there's no solder bridges and make sure that there are no cold solder joints. We want to make sure that when this goes back together, it doesn't have to come apart again. Everything checks out. We're going to put this back into this radio and return it to service, or actually move on to the other modification. So I carefully slide the tabs into their positions here. Then I'm going to recover one of the screws, and I'm going to return back to my number 2 Phillips screwdriver, because my number 2 Phillips is the one that correctly fits these screws. And same thing applies. Even though I'm turning, or I'm screwing into a die-cast aluminum frame here, I'm going to take this screw, I'm going to turn it backwards. Click. Now it goes in. You can see absolutely no torque required. I'm back in the original threads. I'm going to tighten this. As you can see, it's loose. I can wiggle it. And when it no longer wiggles, there, it no longer slides in and out. I'm just going to give it a tiny bit of torque more. That's it. I do not want to crush this plastic tab. They didn't have a lot of torque required to take them out. I'm not going to put a lot of torque on them when I replace them. It's too easy to damage that tab. I'm going to do the same thing here. Turn it backwards. Click. It's going in with absolutely no torque required. I can still wiggle that. Still wiggle it. I'm up against it. About a 1/16 of a turn more. I'm stopping right there so we don't crush that plastic tab. Turn it over. Same process on the other side. We'll put the knobs back on the control shafts, and I'll move on to the other modification. And again, there's so many videos out there about this crystal mod. I'm not going to do another one. I only like to do stuff that I can't find any video on and might help somebody out in their lab. So that's it. Short and sweet. I'm the radio mechanic. Hope somebody out there found this information useful or helpful. If you did, please give us a thumbs up. A subscription is very welcomed. It raises my rankings on YouTube and makes sure that more people see my videos. For now, I'm done. See ya.